Hi-Fi Rush is reminiscent of classic 3D action games in all the right ways. It has the kind of gameplay and creativity that make it feel like a modern telling of a Dreamcast or a PS2 title. If you're familiar with that era, there's a charming sense of nostalgia here that's hard to find elsewhere short of firing up one of those old consoles. And if you aren't, Hi-Fi Rush is still heartfelt and fun in every sense of the word, which is enough to make it worth your time. In any case, there's a specific vibe this game elicits that appeals to a special preteen nostalgia, where media being zany, colorful, and unpredictable was enough to capture your attention. Go beyond that initial hook, and you'll find a game that embraces imaginative gameplay and the pursuit of unadulterated fun, perhaps above all else, something that arguably used to be more commonplace. It's amazing to me just how much Hi-Fi Rush managed to capture that old-school purity without sacrificing on amenities that you would expect from a modern release. In a weird way, even the flaws with this game add to that charm because, for the most part, they feel like the same kind of problems that you can find in old 3D games, which were the result of being products of the time more than anything else. Flaws that arose from experimentation and pushing boundaries, rather than design or implementation mishaps. I don't mean to suggest that Hi-Fi Rush is the most mind-blowingly fun experience you can have nowadays, just that it carries a very retro spirit that's easy to appreciate not only for sentimental reasons, but for functional ones too. Taking the stylish action game quite literally, Hi-Fi Rush opts for a very cartoonish look, which goes a long way in breathing life into its characters and cinematics. Most cutscenes are rendered in-engine, but character models have thick, bold outlines to make them stand out from the background, not unlike what you often see in 2D animation. Environments are also cel-shaded to convey depth and lighting, and their geometry is very rectangular, with most levels being a series of large boxes kind of strung together, which leads to backgrounds looking quite flat. At first it all looks a little uncanny, as if it's in a weird limbo of looking 2D and 3D at the same time, but that feeling dissipates once you've looked at it for a little bit, and committing to this stylization has a lot of advantages that give the game its fantastic visual appeal. For one, the game can and does use a lot of cartoonish animation techniques to make it enjoyable to watch, with great use of exaggerated movements to feel fluid, and it's complemented by a generous use of visual effects that make everything pop just that little bit more. There's a lot of comic book style text for big actions, Chai's hits are met with colorful bursts to accentuate impact, and motion lines are frequently used to emphasize speed. These stylistic choices aren't just for show either. Hi-Fi Rush has some of the best enemy telegraphing I've seen in a character action game, and part of it is due to how exaggerated enemy movements are. Even against enemies with deep movesets, I rarely found it difficult to read their wind-ups and prepare to respond accordingly. For instance, the Brutal has comically long arms that twist in a unique way before each attack, which makes it easy to distinguish when you'll need to parry once and when you'll need to spam it. The Blaze precedes most of its attacks with distinct movements, like the back and forth shimmy before the triple jab, or how it tucks in and slides forward before doing the single fiery punch. All of these attacks are accompanied by distinct, uniform sound cues, which give ample warning to react even to things you can't see, and the rhythm-based combat system helps standardize timings even further since enemy attacks will always land on the beat. Between the sound cues, the rhythm, and the dramatic animation, Hi-Fi Rush is able to alleviate many common problems with telegraphing. Enemies attacking from off-screen are more manageable thanks to the aforementioned rhythm and sound cue mechanisms. If you hear an attack coming, you always know to initiate your defensive maneuver on the following beat regardless of what attack it is. Add on top that no two attacks look or behave too similarly, and it makes most enemies feel unique, fair, and enjoyable to learn. Another great advantage of the art style is how smooth it allows scene transitions to be, which is a small means of alleviating the mental gameplay cutscene divide that many of us have. Because the 3D in-engine cutscenes have that 2D-esque look, transitioning from those to the hand-drawn cutscenes is incredibly seamless. Initiating cutscenes by flying through a puff of smoke in 3D and coming out the other side in 2D is much preferable to, say, fading to black or snapping to a cinematic camera angle and going from there. The reverse is also true. After watching Chai blast through some chaos that may have been too difficult to animate in-engine, we can snap back to 3D and resume gameplay without feeling like we had to be briefly taken out of the experience to get there. It was during these moments that the feeling of playing through a mid-2000s Cartoon Network show was at its strongest, and some of these transitions were so smooth that it took a moment for me to register when there was a switch between 2D and 3D. You could say that's just inattentiveness on my part, but I'm willing to give the game the credit here, since finding greater harmony between gameplay and cinematic is a goal that more games should probably be pursuing. About the only issue I have with the art direction isn't anything to do with the style or aesthetic, it's the abundance of special effects during combat, which can obscure the battlefield and make it difficult to comprehend what's going on. To be fair, some of these feel like necessary additions to properly convey information, like beat hits having very flashy finishers to indicate higher damage, or fire being very prominent to make sure it's noticeable as a field hazard. Outside of those more practical elements though, the game is very visually busy during combat. There's a special effect every time something gets hit, whether that comes from you, the enemy, or your allies, and enemies usually blow up in smoke every time they're defeated. On top of the bright and colorful aesthetic, this naturally leads to situations where visually parsing everything on screen at a moment's notice can be tricky, which is frustrating in a game like this that often requires split-second reactions. Sometimes it's bad enough that your screen can get completely blocked right before you initiate an action, or when you're in the middle of one, which can and does lead to taking damage that feels undeserved. Outside of the more practical effects, the game could have benefited from toning down the effects that are purely aesthetic. Beyond that, the whimsical art style suits other elements of the game very well, meshing nicely with the lighthearted story that mostly aims to hit feel-good beats more than anything else. Conceptually, it's equally cartoonish, and probably not something that would win any awards for storytelling, but it is surprisingly entertaining and coherent, enough so that I would certainly consider it a net positive on the game overall. The writing arguably falls into the trend of using quippy one-liners and a lot of self-aware humor, some of which doesn't always land, but it isn't frustratingly ironic about it in the way that one might expect. Some of the dialogue and a lot of the vlogs openly poke fun at the gameplay narrative discrepancies and design patterns that Hi-Fi Rush itself uses, so there's never a sense that it's taking itself too seriously or using self-awareness to prop itself above what it is. Ultimately, I found most of the humor quite endearing. Despite being fairly lowbrow, it's still witty and unpredictable. There's a lot of visual gags that play nicely to its characters, and it has great comedic timing across the board. It never lingers on a single joke for too long, and any recurring bits are more subtle, like the whole thing with the rogue coffee machine employee, so I ultimately never found any of the jokes tiresome. If that sort of simple, cartoony humor isn't your style, I don't think Hi-Fi Rush will change your mind or anything, but if you're willing to let the silliness wash over you, the writing is very charming, and more importantly, sincere about what it's trying to be. In that respect, they got the tone just right. Pacing as a whole is something that the story mostly does well, though there are just a few small things that I think could have been improved. If you ask me, Korsica's recruitment arc drags on a little bit too long since it felt pretty obvious that she would eventually join your team. It's 2 lengthy missions and 1 short mission worth of build-up leading to a very predictable outcome. That time could have been better spent on expanding a couple things that feel a little bit underdeveloped. For instance, I would have liked to see some more time spent exploring Chai's insecurity around his arm, which could have made breaking out of the force field in Track 11 more cathartic. As it stands now, all of his inner conflict arises and resolves itself within this short scene. While I can understand them not wanting to delve too deeply into heavy emotions, Peppermint's backstory was still handled well in the context of a lighthearted game, so doing something similar with Chai could have been beneficial to make that climax just a little bit more impactful. Those nitpicks aside, Chai and Ko's objectives work well enough as motivators that send them on some wacky misadventures, and that's about all the story had to do to be successful from a writing standpoint given the cartoony subject matter. While there isn't much time for extensive relationship building due to the game's short length, there is a genuine sense of camaraderie by the end that's enough to make you care about seeing the team succeed. Much of this can be attributed to Track 11, which gives off a very innocent excitement of watching our ragtag band of misfits finally facing off against the big bad evil guy. Not only is everybody given equal screen time to help Chai out in their own way, it's greatly elevated by the more upbeat music track that plays uninterrupted to the end. For the record, I captured all of my footage in streamer mode due to copyright concerns, but nevertheless, whirring and its equivalent track surfacing sounds very inspiring when combined with the familiar crowd cheering sound effects, and hearing the chorus play at the start of every fight was a genuinely uplifting experience. The unbridled optimism the game had for itself and its characters in this moment rubbed off on me, and it was a great enough high that I think it's a strong payoff for the rest of the journey, even for those that didn't gel with the plot much. The final arc overall was brilliantly done, with tracks 10 to 12 easily being the high point of the game for me. Along with the aforementioned entirety of track 11, the cafeteria fight in track 10 was an incredibly exciting moment, and the inclusion of Invaders Must Die has become one of my favorite instances of licensed music in a game. Part of it is due to the raw hype it offers, but it also helps that it's one of the more enjoyable to fight to strictly from a gameplay perspective. Barring streamer mode equivalents, Invaders Must Die is one of the only electronic songs in the whole game, and it has a much more prominent beat than any of the alternative rock songs that dominate the rest of the soundtrack, and since everything you're doing is ideally on the beat, it gives every action a more hearty impact. I myself am about the furthest thing possible from being musically inclined, but Invaders Must Die is one of the only songs where I feel I can successfully play just by focusing on the music, rather than landing my button timings through pattern recognition and what is essentially brute force practice. Simply put, the heavier beat makes it easier to intuit naturally. Through the Halls of History is similar on this front, which makes me wonder if including more non-rock tracks would have been beneficial not only to break up the homogenization, but also to underline more fights with that feeling of heavier impact. At any rate, while these story beats were great for the overall experience, it would be fair to say that Hi-Fi Rush still indulges in its story too much. Interruptions in gameplay are common in order to play short cinematics or initiate dialogue, and these interruptions are disproportionately long to the point where it hurts the pacing. It's not just for story either, there are a handful of tutorials that persist on subsequent playthroughs. The real kicker is that some of these interruptions, probably even most of them, are completely unskippable, and for the ones that aren't, it isn't exactly smooth. First you have to hold the B button, then there's a short delay, then it jumps to a little bit before the end of the cutscene and plays the last 3 to 5 seconds of it before continuing. Hopefully it's self-explanatory why these are problems for a fast-paced action game like this, but in case they sound like petty criticisms, it's important to remember that these things add up. Character action games lend themselves well to repeat playthroughs, and Hi-Fi Rush is no exception. There's tons of collectibles, upgrades, and secrets crammed into each level, and ideally you'll want to beat the game on Rhythm Master, which only unlocks after beating the game once. If you want to experience everything the game has to offer, you're looking at 3 to 5 full playthroughs, which makes all of those little delays before and after skipping cutscenes and all of the tutorial or story sequences much more glaring. Unfortunately, I think all of these interruptions are the only major blunder that Hi-Fi Rush made. Personally, I find that the combat, aesthetic, and everything else are enjoyable enough that I'm still willing to go back and play my favorite tracks again, even if I know that it'll drag at some points, but it is still hard to settle into a consistent flow where you can simply enjoy the gameplay for what it is. All things considered, creating a more seamless play experience would have saved a decent chunk of time, and it remains about the only issue in Hi-Fi Rush that I find hard to excuse. Some might find that the platforming and exploration elements between combat encounters harms the pacing in a similar fashion, since there are quite a few rudimentary jumping and dashing challenges in most levels, but I think there's something to be said about the fact that Hi-Fi Rush isn't just a string of combat challenges from one area to the next. This more balanced approach of adding gaps between combat gives the player some much needed breaks and makes the game feel like a more complete package as a whole, but more importantly, I think it harkens back to the game preserving some of that old school spirit. Around the time of the PlayStation 2, when character action games began to take off, there was a greater sense of experimentation that arguably isn't as common anymore. Part of that is just the nature of the times, since the gaming medium was younger than it is now, but nevertheless, peculiar design was almost expected since developers were still trying to find out what worked and what didn't. Devil May Cry is an action game at its core, but it wasn't afraid to shake things up. It featured platforming challenges, some simple puzzle solving, and there were a handful of areas where the gameplay would be switched to something else altogether. Say what you will about how these sections were unwieldy or haven't aged well, they still lend a certain variety to the level design that remains enjoyable to this day. It's never as simple as moving Dante from point A to point B. When you aren't fighting, you still have to remain mentally engaged, such as to solve all the little challenges blocking your path, and I would argue that they struck a nice balance of diversifying their gameplay without making anything overly intrusive on subsequent playthroughs. If we look ahead to the more recent Devil May Cry 5, it does away with all the level design quirks that the previous games had. Missions are now self-contained, linear pathways from start to end. You kill the enemies in one room, move to the next room, and do that until you beat a boss, rinse and repeat for all 20 missions. They even went as far as to include a button that blatantly tells you where to go, an arguably redundant feature anyway since it's so difficult to get lost. This certainly gives the combat more time to shine, but there's a weaker sense of novelty and makes it feel like the most repetitive title in the series. The game doesn't aspire to be anything more than a combat sandbox, which, to be clear, is great in its own way, it just gives it less personality than the other games. There's far fewer surprises, and virtually nothing to engage with when you're not fighting. I was very glad to see Hi-Fi Rush defy most of that. Similar to DMC1, it attempts to inject some fun into different areas, and I'd say it's largely successful at doing so. Some might find the platforming a little unwieldy, since, like most action games, your jump gives you significantly more vertical distance than horizontal, but I also can't deny that a little bit of jank reminds me of that time when controlling a character in 3D space was still being figured out, which has a sort of quaint charm to it. Even then, I think some basic platforming here and there is much preferable to just holding the analog stick in the right direction for long enough until you're fed another combat encounter. These traversal periods also give characters room to develop, since that's where most of the talking is. Presenting dialogue in parallel with gameplay is a great, non-intrusive way of moving the story forward while giving ample time for everyone's personality to shine despite a short runtime. Beyond that, there's also some environmental hazards and timed button challenges sprinkled in that, for as simple as they are, help break up the repetition and add some much-needed variety to each track. There are also just enough level gimmicks, for lack of a better word, to keep things fresh. The escape sequence at the end of track 4, which is primarily done on the magnet rail, is a genuinely enjoyable stand-in for a traditional boss fight. It's one of the few chances in the main campaign where you get to fight to a higher BPM song, which invokes a sense of urgency that isn't quite found elsewhere. Korsica's quote-unquote fight in track 7 is another unconventional encounter that's nicely placed at the end of a long, combat-heavy track that might have been too exhausting if it ended with a fully fledged boss fight. Lastly, Zonzo's robot at the end of track 11 is a brilliant set piece that's partially enjoyable for the sheer spectacle, and partially for giving the whole team a chance to shine together, which lends well to the whole optimistic feeling I praised the level for earlier. Diversity aside, I think another part of why these gameplay shifts are enjoyable is because they don't feel intrusive. All of these concepts are introduced to you in lower stakes situations beforehand and show up in small doses during regular gameplay. So when the game suddenly throws an ultimate, rail, parry, or rhythm challenge at you, you're already acclimated to how it works, which makes it easier to enjoy the surrounding music, art, story, and spectacle. They give less whiplash than traditional QTEs, since you don't have to frantically learn how they work as soon as they come up. While the visuals appeal to that childhood or teenage nostalgia in a mostly artistic way, tapping into these older design trends of gameplay shifts, haphazard platforming, and whatever else does so in a more mechanical way, and coalescing those things together is where most of the game's value lies. Its preservation, in a more metaphorical sense, Hi-Fi Rush is a great balance of showing some things that games used to do while still breaking new ground in an established genre. I don't mean to romanticize the past too much, it's just that memories like that can be special, and managing to evoke them without hinging on pre-established IPs or cheap appeals to the quote-unquote good old days is an achievement worth celebrating. All of these things are nice complementary twists to the core gameplay, which shows the same kind of creativity with its rhythm, character, action combo. While I think there's some untapped potential that Hi-Fi Rush could have explored further, it's a very commendable first iteration of this particular gameplay fusion. The complaints I have about the combat system aren't really attributable to its rhythmic elements, and are instead an accumulation of mild frustrations, which is to say that they really succeeded where it counts the most. It's a unique and brazenly fun entry in the character action genre that takes all the foundational pillars and puts a unique spin on its combat to differentiate itself from its cousins. Everything in Hi-Fi Rush happens on the beat. Your attacks land on the beat, you block on the beat, and you're rewarded in various ways for timing your button presses in sync with the music. I mentioned earlier that I'm not very musically inclined at all, and if you're the same way, Hi-Fi Rush sounds very intimidating when you first hear it. The prospect of getting good was a daunting one, since our sense of rhythm often feels like an innate talent that's difficult to train without hours of dedicated practice, and playing the game for the first time did feel extremely foreign. As time went on though, it became impressive to me how accessible this game really is to newcomers despite this tricky mechanical barrier. First off, Hi-Fi Rush is not as complex as something like DMC or Bayonetta, in large part due to having fewer combat mechanics. There's no enemy step, no dodge offset, no weapon switching, etc. Timing everything to the beat is probably the hardest thing you'll have to learn. This comes with exactly the kind of trade-off you would probably expect. Hi-Fi Rush's relative simplicity means that veterans will probably get less time out of it, but playing through it for the first time isn't an overwhelming experience even if you're new to the genre. And if you ask me, one of the game's unique value propositions is being a strong entry point for character action newcomers. One of the core principles of character action games is the notion that you can always be improving. DMC, Bayonetta, and the like have such high skill ceilings that they can take hundreds of hours of gameplay to perfect, and even then, there might always be some little optimization you can make to your gameplay that makes it more efficient and/or more stylish. Again, Hi-Fi Rush does not have the sheer combat complexity to satisfy that principle to the same degree, but it still manifests in a more accessible way due to its rhythm focus. Improving your timing to land everything on the beat is the optimization you can continuously make, and while it has a lower skill ceiling, since 100% just timing is an objective limit on how good you can get on this front, it still works as a strong motivator that entices you to keep practicing. Timing your actions to the music is an inherently satisfying concept, and listening for the beat while visually monitoring everything on screen caused a confusing crossover of senses that I found very satisfying to gradually overcome. Factoring just timing into your ranking is a simple idea, but also a brilliant one, since it's a measure of your skill that can be presented in an objective way, making it clear how well you're playing and how much you're improving from level to level. On that subject, I think the ranking system on the whole is very well thought out. There's the aforementioned just timing, but your score and clear time for each chorus also factor in. The score is determined just by playing the game well, by doing things like not getting hit, varying up your moves, and so on, but the length of your combo also factors in. Every 10 hits without taking damage results in a large score boost, capping out at 16,000 points at 100 hits. Your hit counter has a short timer before it resets though, so an ever-present challenge with achieving high scores wasn't just avoiding damage, it was finding ways to regularly deal it as well. Not only does this encourage more skilled gameplay, it also taps into the rhythm game aspect in a sensible way. It gives a similar impression of hitting all the right notes to maximize your score multiplier, and I appreciate that sense of cohesion even if it's mostly symbolic. Even as someone who adores complex combat systems, I think making the beat the centerpiece of the combat was a smart choice for these reasons. Hi-Fi Rush isn't trying to compete with its inspirations, instead it preserves their DNA while differentiating itself in a novel way. That's not to say that Hi-Fi Rush is shallow though, there's still a healthy variety of tools in Chai's arsenal that each have their place. The combo list isn't super long, but it feels streamlined in such a way that each move has a unique use case that makes it viable. Breakdown and Stomp Box are your best AoE options, with the former being better for racking up lots of hits, and the latter being better for launching enemies farther away. Tremolo and Pickup Crash are powerful single-target moves with a similar distinction, with Pickup Crash in particular being an incredibly satisfying finisher. There's also lots of solid options with going from ground-to-air combos or vice versa, with things like Echo Splash, Arpeggio Stab, and Compressor Slam. The special moves are similar, and finding cool ways to integrate them into combat has been where a lot of the stylish flair has been for me personally. They too have that exaggerated touch with crazy animations and sound effects, all while looking cool in the process. Giving each move a uniquely strong application to discover, while keeping the overall combo list fairly modest, is another way that complexity is balanced with accessibility, and successfully satisfies both ends of that spectrum. The game has an overall brilliant boss lineup for you to test all these abilities on, with each of them managing to feel unique, challenging, and memorable. All of them excel in presentation, with great licensed song choices across the board, which, combined with their larger-than-life personalities, gives them so much character. Even for the bosses that have limited screen time, they're kept memorable by their fantastic character design and catchy music, and the experience of fighting them really stuck with me. There's 6 bosses total, which feels like a nice number to round them out. There aren't any recycled concepts between fights, and all of them have varying degrees of complexity, so no one feels too samey to fight. Kale is my personal favorite, since he feels like he has the most moveset variety, allowing you to dig deeply into your own arsenal to deal with everything. Aside from the more puzzle-esque Phase 2, there's constant engagement with him, and executing all the required actions while staying in rhythm leads to one of the most satisfying fights in the game. The only one I don't enjoy fighting as much on repeat playthroughs is Roquefort, partially due to his awkward phase transitions, and partially due to attacks that feel a little unintuitive to counter, but he's still comfortably within the realm of fair, so I don't have anything substantial to complain about. There's no boss fights that drag, and all of them feel like they have a place, adding more onto the game's overall sense of cohesion. Each of your friendly summons also fill their own niches, and generally suit the combat system well, albeit with a few awkward caveats. Given that they act independently of Chai, ideally they would have abilities that work well alongside yours, and for the most part that's true. Outside of special moves, Peppermint is your only option for a true ranged attack, and being able to shoot with her while using Chai for melee allows for some interesting setups. Juggling can only be done with Peppermint's guns, which is quite a clever implementation of the mechanic. Because of her cooldown, you can't completely trivialize enemies by keeping them in the air indefinitely, so you need to take a bit more care in how you use it. You can have her keep an enemy suspended while Chai winds up a combo on the ground for a stylish finisher, or use it to temporarily take a threat out of the picture while dealing with something else. I find Macaron a bit less unique since his effect of knocking enemies back is something that Chai is capable of doing innately, and he suffers from having a really big model which contributes to the visual clutter issues outlined earlier. He does have a niche of stunning the Senko though, which is incredibly helpful since they're so mobile. Gravity Well also allows for some stylish setups, as does Corsica's Typhoon, which is extremely reliable for building up high hit counts. Still, there are some clunky elements to the summons which can make them disruptive to use. Barriers and Z-shielding are maybe the biggest part of the combat that I question. Barring special moves, they can only be broken by using Peppermint and Macaron respectively, which can hurt the pace of combat. Summons work on a cooldown, but some enemies can take multiple summons to break. When there are other targets you can focus on, this is less of an issue, but when there are only barriered or Z-shielded enemies on the field, it creates some dead time as you wait for your cooldowns to end. To the game's credit, the parry counters help alleviate this issue somewhat, but they still require a degree of passive waiting, so I don't feel that they're a perfect solution. If this were a more one-off gimmick on a single enemy type, I think it'd be easier to appreciate, but generally I would say that a game like this is better off keeping empty time to a minimum during combat. Incidentally, the red enemies are my favorite to fight because you can still fully engage with them regardless of whether Corsica is available to snuff out the flames. Their fire attacks present a very significant danger, so there's still strong incentive to use Corsica, but she isn't required to beat them, and you can still fight as normal while the fire buff is active. I think I would have preferred if one of either barriers or Z-shielding was replaced with something similar. Instead of granting damage immunity, they could provide some kind of buff to enemies that you manage by using their respective summon. Not only could it help reduce the empty time issue, it would also help lower redundancy, since barriers and Z-shielding are functionally quite similar. A broader quirk with summons that's worth a bit more scrutiny is how they're one of the few combat mechanics that don't have any incentive to be timed with the music. Unlike almost everything else, switching partners and summoning partners doesn't have any visual or auditory feedback when properly timed, and there's no kind of bonus offered by doing so. This makes them feel awkward to use when you're in the middle of combat simply for the way it confuses your brain. You're doing one action in sync with the music at the same time as another out of sync with the music. It sounds small, but it doesn't take much to throw off your rhythm, and I think it illustrates why something else about Hi-Fi Rush works in the way that it does. Perhaps the most contentious component of the combat system is the lack of a hard lock-on, which is quite an oddity for a 3D action game. Admittedly, I find it hard to make a firm judgment on this. One perspective is that it's another means of Hi-Fi Rush defying convention in exchange for experimentation and innovation, which again lends it that mechanical nostalgia by letting go of preconceived notions about what an action game should or shouldn't have. Hard lock-ons are typically the standard, but maybe that's only because not enough other targeting systems have been tried. More importantly, it's also possible that locking on could be distracting since it would be another core component of the combat system that doesn't work in sync with the beat. By which I mean, a traditional lock-on would presumably allow you to switch targets without any incentive to time it to the music. The summons already show how that feels a little awkward, but if you're not convinced, you could kind of test how it would feel right now. Grab your nearest controller and tap a face button to the standard 1, 2, 3, 4 beat while pressing a shoulder button at random intervals. For the shoulder button, do a string of quick taps, space them out a little, try a variety, just make sure to continue tapping the face button to the beat at all times. Feel free to pause if you'd like to give it a try. I imagine that for many of us, one of two things will happen when you do this. Either you'll instinctively press the shoulder button only on the beat, or pressing the shoulder button will mix up your hands, and you'll have to readjust your face button taps a little to get back on beat. Either way, it's tricky to press the shoulder button exactly when you want to without throwing off your rhythm, which is the kind of stiffness that might result from a standard lock-on. Pressing a separate button to keep switching targets until you land on the desired one could feel cumbersome if you're trying to maintain your rhythm at the same time. Of course, maybe it's something you could hone with practice, and that little experiment doesn't prove much alone, but my point is, I could imagine how a lock-on system could be clunky and distract from the main draw of the combat. I can also understand the desire to automate the lock-on process from just a more fundamental perspective. The act of locking on isn't an engaging mechanic in and of itself, and I admire pushes to find a reliable alternative. That isn't to say that Hi-Fi Rush's auto-target approach is perfect, though. While it has a greater success rate at choosing my desired enemy than a lot of other games I've played, there is more reliability in hard lock-on systems that I really missed when the soft lock wasn't cooperating. One recurring issue is that Hi-Fi Rush is a game where target prioritization can really matter. Senkos provide barriers to everything else, so I like eliminating them first, and blazes can hit you while you're airborne, which can be very disruptive, so I like going for them as well. However, when enemies like this are put into large groups, things can and do go wrong. All the things you would expect are prone to happening, like Chai randomly switching targets, or the lock-on just not picking an enemy for whatever reason. Both a traditional hard lock-on and this soft lock approach present their own issues, which leads me to think that this could be where some of Hi-Fi Rush's missed potential is. Finding a way to create a reliable targeting system that can somehow be harmonized with the normal rhythm mechanics might have been very interesting. I can understand why Tango may not have wanted to take that approach, since it could have resulted in a more polarizing game. Lock-on is one of those things that's largely standardized across most 3D games. We always expect it to behave in some familiar way, so anything deviating from that could be alienating. Even so, the idealist in me wonders what that could have been like. Even if it hadn't worked out mechanically, or resulted in the game feeling very different, it would at least be another contributor to Hi-Fi Rush feeling like an older, experimental work just for the novelty alone. Anything working towards that larger goal would have at least that small positive spin on it. To summarize, there are justifications for why Hi-Fi Rush's lock-on behaves the way it does, and I appreciate the simple fact that it tries to do things differently, but the solution it opted for shows that there's still room for improvement. While lock-on issues mostly feel like small blips of annoyance when you're playing the game casually, they become noticeably more frustrating at higher levels of play when precision and prioritization are most important to the player. Advanced play is something else with a bit of missed potential, again not because of shallow mechanics or anything, but because a little more could have been done to challenge skilled players without compromising on ease of access. I've almost S-ranked everything on Rhythm Master at this point, and by and large it was an enjoyable experience, but the sense of satisfaction isn't as strong as some other games due to how Rhythm Master works. Changing enemy placements on higher difficulties is a tried and true way of enhancing difficulty in more creative ways than just pumping up numbers, but enemy placements on Rhythm Master remain unchanged, which was a bit of a disappointment. This is another part where the color-coded barrier and Z-shielded enemies may have been a detriment. Because those enemies require Peppermint and Macaron to defeat, but a player could theoretically do a new game on Rhythm Master where you start without them, they couldn't be placed any earlier than Peppermint and Mac's recruitment tracks, since then they would be impossible to kill. The fire enemies aren't as strict with this requirement, but they may have been hesitant to place them before Corsica's recruitment since they were technically designed with her in mind. Even so, between the fire enemies, the samurai, the birds, senkos, and so on, I think Rhythm Master could have used more unique enemy layouts and would have benefited greatly by doing so. Rhythm Tower and the post-game arcade modes scratch this itch a little bit since they do feature unique enemies and they're some of the most challenging and enjoyable to fight in my book, but it isn't quite the same consistent difficulty challenge that could have been provided by Rhythm Master. Rhythm Master has the additional quirk of giving an instant game over if your overall rank drops to D. While this sounds incredibly punishing at first, the game is actually very forgiving when it comes to maintaining your rank during fights, to the point where I hardly noticed it. Even basic actions like killing enemies or completing combos increases it quite a bit, and it depletes very slowly, which means that the only time losing your rank is a threat is either when you're playing abysmally bad, or the occasional moment where you'll need to wait for something scripted to happen during a chorus. In those instances, spamming actions on the beat is needed to stay alive. This overall feels like a missed opportunity to make Rhythm Master tap into the game's musical side even more. For instance, requiring a certain just timing percentage instead could have been more appropriate, since, like I talked about earlier, that's the most interesting measure of skill that Hi-Fi Rush offers, and is a more unique parameter to this game specifically, rather than just a regular ranking. It'd also be a lot more in line with the name Rhythm Master. As a footnote to this point, 85% feels a bit low of a threshold to meet to achieve an S rank on just timing, and I think I would have preferred if it was made stricter across the board, since S ranks don't feel very elusive in their current state. Despite all these complaints, I'd like to close this out by reiterating something I mentioned earlier. None of these problems ultimately take away from the core of Hi-Fi Rush. For the most part, they're secondary kinks that never got fully ironed out, which is understandable given that this kind of game was new territory for Tango. As far as the rhythm action gameplay goes, it's explored well enough to make the game unique, and allows Hi-Fi Rush to join the ranks of character action greats. It's reassuring to see the niche being kept alive by knockout titles like this. At the end of the day, Hi-Fi Rush is a heartfelt reminder of what it's like for a game to be weird, inventive, and fun just for the sake of it. The story is simple, but it isn't afraid to be silly. The art style is loud and eccentric in the best way possible, like playing through a cartoon I would have loved when I was younger. And that retro spirit is exemplified by some old-fashioned design quirks that are presented in an endearing way rather than an outdated one, and elevates Hi-Fi Rush into an absolute blast from the metaphorical past. If you watched this far without having played the game yourself, I still encourage you to give it a try. The satisfaction of stringing everything together to the music isn't something that can be felt on video, and there's still plenty of jokes, story beats, and brilliant licensed tracks I haven't mentioned that are worth experiencing for yourself. Turn on your favorite mid-2000s playlist to get yourself in the mood, and once you dive in, you'll find a wonderfully charming action experience that was clearly made with lots of love and passion. Thanks for watching. If you happen to enjoy, feel free to do the whole like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help out, and I appreciate all the support. I hope you were able to get something out of the video, and I hope to see you come back for the next one.